The studio clock read 11:47 p.m. When Frank Sinatra walked into Studio A. He was 40 minutes late. No one said anything. The session musicians had been sitting for an hour. 23 men in suits, instruments ready, charts on stands. The trumpet players had their mouthpieces warm. The string section sat with bows in hand, waiting. Nelson Riddle stood at the podium with his baton, motionless, studying a score he'd already memorized. The engineer sat behind the glass, hands folded on the console, watching the empty microphone through the booth window. The air in the room smelled like cigarette smoke and wood polish. Studio A was Capitol's crown jewel. High ceilings, live acoustics, the kind of room where you could hear a man's breath between notes. The walls had absorbed thousands of sessions. Nat King Cole, Peggy Lee, Les Paul, but tonight the room felt different, tighter. In the back corner near the piano sat three men in dark overcoats. They hadn't touched their instruments, they weren't session players, they had briefcases. They'd been sitting there since 10:30, not talking, just watching the door. The bass player had asked who they were. No one answered. Voyle Gilmore, the producer, stood when Sinatra entered. He was holding a piece of paper, folded once, creased down the middle. His hand was damp. He'd been holding it for 20 minutes. "Frank," he said, "we need to talk about the arrangement." Sinatra didn't look at him. He walked to the microphone in the center of the room, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. He adjusted the mic stand 2 inches down, touched the mesh screen with 2 fingers, then turned to Riddle. "What's the first chart?" Riddle glanced at Gilmore, then back at Sinatra. His face was careful. "Close to you." Sinatra nodded once. "Let's hear it." Gilmore took a step forward. His voice was steady but quiet. "Frank, Capitol wants changes to the orchestration they sent." "I didn't ask what Capitol wants." The room went still, not the kind of still where people pause, the kind where breathing becomes deliberate, where 23 musicians suddenly understand that the wrong sound, a shifted foot, a cleared throat will be heard by everyone. Gilmore's hand tightened around the paper. The fold split slightly under his thumb. He was a company man, 10 years with the label. He'd produced Nat King Cole's biggest hits, Peggy Lee's Black Coffee, dozens of sessions that became gold records. He knew how studios worked, contracts, approval chains, A&R hierarchy. He knew when artists pushed and when they didn't. He knew what happened when someone pushed too far. "They sent representatives," Gilmore said quietly. "They're here to supervise the session." Sinatra looked at the 3 men in the corner. They didn't move. One of them had a briefcase balanced on his lap, both hands resting on top of it. His posture was perfect. He looked like a man who'd sat through 100 board meetings and never blinked first. "Supervise," Sinatra repeated. The word had no inflection. "Yes." "Get them out." Gilmore's face went pale. The paper trembled in his hand. "Frank, they're from the label. They have authorization from—" "I don't care if they have authorization from the Pope. Get them out." The man with the briefcase stood, slowly. He smoothed the front of his coat with one hand. He was older, maybe 55, gray hair combed back, expensive suit with a silk tie. He had the look of someone used to being listened to, someone who spoke last in meetings because his opinion ended discussions. "Mr. Sinatra," he said. His voice was calm, measured, the kind of voice that never hurried. "I'm Martin Haas, vice president of A&R Capitol, has invested considerable resources into this album. We simply want to ensure the arrangements align with commercial viability." Sinatra turned to face him fully. He didn't raise his voice, didn't change his expression. "You're in my session." "This is a Capitol Records session," Haas said. He said it the way someone recites a fact, not aggressive, not apologetic, just true. "Funded by Capitol, distributed by Capitol, promoted by Capitol, and per your contract." "My contract says I have creative control. Within reasonable parameters." "Reasonable," Sinatra said. The word hung in the air like smoke. The second violinist shifted in her seat. The sound of fabric against wood was loud enough that she froze mid-movement. Haas opened the briefcase. Inside were folders, contracts, charts, everything organized. He pulled out a single folder, dark blue, embossed with the Capitol Records logo. He opened it with one hand. "We have notes on the string arrangement for Close to You," he said. His tone hadn't changed, still calm, still factual, too heavy. "The market research suggests listeners respond better to brass-forward arrangements, something brighter, more up-tempo energy. And on I've Got You Under My Skin, we'd like to reduce the orchestral intro from 16 bars to 8. Radio play requires." "Nelson," Sinatra said, cutting him off. He didn't look away from Haas. "Who wrote these arrangements?" Riddle's voice was quiet. "I did, Frank." "Who hired you?" "You did." "Who's conducting tonight?" "I am." Sinatra turned back to Haas. "You have a problem with Nelson Riddle's arrangements." The room was so quiet you could hear the tape machine hum behind the glass. Haas hesitated, just for a second. Just long enough that everyone noticed. Everyone in the industry knew Nelson Riddle's reputation. The man had created the Sinatra sound, the lush strings that never overpowered the vocal, the swinging brass that pushed without rushing, the space between notes that made a ballad breathe. Riddle didn't write arrangements, he wrote architecture. "It's not about Mr. Riddle's talent," Haas said carefully. "It's about market research, radio play, what audiences respond to. We have data." "Audiences respond to me." The words were soft, almost conversational, but they landed like a door closing. Haas's jaw tightened. He set the folder down on the piano bench. His hands were steady, but something in his posture had shifted. He was a man who understood power structures. He'd been in boardrooms, negotiation tables, contract disputes with talent twice as difficult as Sinatra. He knew when to push and when to hold position. He knew how to handle artists who thought they were bigger than the system. "Mr. Sinatra," he said, and now there was an edge under the calm. "I understand you have strong feelings about your art, but this label has made you a very wealthy man. We've given you resources, promotion, distribution, access. Without capital." "Without me," Sinatra said, "you have nothing." The engineer behind the glass leaned forward slightly. He'd worked hundreds of sessions. He'd never heard anyone talk to an executive like this. Haas closed the folder slowly. His hands were steady, but the vein at his temple had appeared. He picked up the briefcase and held it at his side. "I'm not leaving this session," Haas said. His voice was still calm, but it had gone cold, formal. "And if you refuse to record with capital oversight, that's a breach of contract. We'll suspend the album, we'll suspend your releases, and we'll take this to litigation. I've been authorized to make that decision tonight." No one moved. The trumpet player in the second row forgot to breathe for 5 seconds. Sinatra looked at Haas for a long moment. His face didn't change. He turned and looked at the clock. 11:53 p.m. Then he walked to the glass booth. His footsteps were the only sound in the room. He pressed the intercom button with one finger. "Call Alan Livingston at home," he said to the engineer. "Frank," Gilmore started. "Call him." Alan Livingston was the president of Capitol Records. It was almost midnight on a Tuesday. The engineer looked at Gilmore. Gilmore didn't move. The engineer dialed. The phone rang 4 times. Each ring echoed through the studio speakers. The musicians sat frozen. Some of them looked at their shoes. Others stared straight ahead. Finally, a voice, groggy, irritated. "Hello." "Mr. Livingston, I'm sorry to wake you. Frank Sinatra is on the line." There was a pause, a rustling sound. Then the voice came back, suddenly alert. "Put him on." Sinatra took the phone. He didn't say hello. He didn't apologize for the time. "Alan, I have 3 men in my session telling me how to make my album. One of them just threatened to suspend my releases." There was a pause on the other end. Not long. Maybe 3 seconds. But in those 3 seconds, everyone in the room understood that something had shifted. "Who's there?" Livingston's voice was tight. "Martin Haas, 2 others." Another pause. Longer this time. 6 seconds, 7. In the booth, the engineer watched the tape reels turn, not recording anything. In the studio, a clarinet player put his instrument down carefully, like it might break if he moved too fast. Haas stood perfectly still. His face was calm, but his breathing had changed. Put him on, Livingston said. Sinatra held out the phone to Haas. He didn't say anything, just held it out. Haas took the receiver. His hand was steady. His voice was steady. Alan, we discussed this. The A&R oversight was approved by. He stopped, listened. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. I understand, but the commercial direction we outlined. He stopped again. His jaw worked silently for a moment. Yes, sir. He listened for 10 more seconds. Then he hung up the phone very gently and handed it back to Sinatra. He picked up his briefcase, looked at the other two men, nodded toward the door. They stood, gathered their coats. One of them had left a notebook on the piano. He didn't go back for it. They walked out. The door closed behind them with a soft click. For 5 seconds, no one in the studio moved. Gilmore stood frozen, the paper still in his hand. It was damp now, crumpled at the edges. Sinatra hung up the phone, walked back to the microphone, looked at Riddle. What's the first chart? Riddle lifted his baton. His hand didn't shake. Close to you. Let's hear it. The orchestra played. The strings came in first, warm and full, then the brass exactly where Riddle had written them. The arrangement was perfect, rich, alive. Sinatra stood at the microphone with his eyes closed, listening. His head moved slightly with the melody. When the last note faded, he opened his eyes and looked at Riddle. That's it, he said quietly. That's exactly it. They recorded until 3:15 a.m. 7 songs, most in 1 or 2 takes. When Sinatra sang, I've Got You Under My Skin, the brass section leaned forward without realizing it. The strings swelled at exactly the right moment, and Riddle conducted with his eyes closed, his baton tracing shapes in the smoke-filled air. The trombone player would tell the story for 30 years, how the room felt alive, how Sinatra's voice cut through the orchestra like a knife through silk, how you could feel the anger in his phrasing, controlled and precise. The session ended at 3:17 a.m. Sinatra thanked the musicians, shook Riddle's hand, told Gilmore he'd see him next week. Then he walked out into the Hollywood night alone. The album became a swingin' affair. It went gold in 6 months. The arrangements were taught in music schools for decades. Nelson Riddle won a Grammy. Critics called it one of the finest vocal jazz albums ever recorded. Martin Haas left Capitol Records 6 months later. The official reason was pursuing other opportunities. He took a position at RCA. He never spoke publicly about the session. When a journalist asked him about working with Sinatra, he said, "Mr. Sinatra is a consummate professional," and changed the subject. But people in the industry knew. They knew that when you walked into a Sinatra session, you didn't bring notes. You didn't bring commercial considerations. You didn't bring market research or A&R oversight or anyone who thought they could tell Frank Sinatra what his music should sound like. Because Frank didn't negotiate with executives who confused investment with ownership. He just made them call their boss at midnight. And the ones who understood power knew that was the coldest move of all, not because it was loud, because it was silent. Gilmore stayed on as producer. He and Sinatra made 6 more albums together. But Gilmore never brought Capitol oversight into a session again, never mentioned the label's concerns, never folded another piece of paper in his hand while waiting for Sinatra to arrive. Years later, someone asked Riddle what it was like working with Sinatra that night. Riddle thought for a moment. He was in his 60s by then, gray-haired, still conducting, still writing arrangements that made singers sound like they were born in the right key. He didn't raise his voice once, Riddle said. That's what scared them. The interviewer asked what he meant. Riddle smiled, didn't answer, but the musicians who'd been there understood. They understood that anger is loud and temporary, but control, real control, is silent and permanent. And that night in Studio A, with 3 men in overcoats and 23 musicians holding their breath, Frank Sinatra showed everyone in the room what control looked like. It looked like a phone call. It looked like a man who knew exactly how much power he had and exactly when to use it. It looked like someone who understood that the most dangerous thing you can do in a negotiation is stay calm while the other person realizes they've already lost. When you have the power to make someone's boss fire them with a single phone call at midnight, and you do it calmly, quietly, without anger or explanation, are you protecting your art? Or are you showing everyone in the room that you're the only one who decides what's worth protecting? And when the people who were there never forget how silent you were when you ended someone's career, is that respect? Or is that fear?